Okay, great. We're live. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. So my name is Sydney Allen. I'm the Climate Justice Editor for Global Voices Climate Justice Fellowship. And we are joined today by three amazing journalists from around the world. Why don't I give you guys the chance to introduce yourself, and then we can chat about, we can share a little more about what we're talking about today. Brian, maybe you go first.
Sure. My name is Brian Hu from Taiwan, and I'm the founder of an independent media called New Blue Magazine that was founded in 2014. And so we write on social issues in Taiwan, politics, also art and culture, and we run a physical space as well to do talks and discussions and events.
Great. And Nurbek?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nurbek Bekmusaev. I'm a journalist based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and I work as a Central Asia editor at Global Voices, and I'm also one of the Climate Justice Fellows in this second iteration of the project, covering Central Asian countries, Mongolia, Afghanistan.
And Hasia.
Thanks, Sydney, and hi everyone. My name is Hasha. I'm a freelance journalist based in Indonesia. Currently, I'm working for the New York Times and also freelancing for others media outlets like the Jacob Project, and also like I'm part of the Climate Justice Fellow this year, and I'm covering Southeast Asia. And
Great, thank you guys. So for our viewers, I'll give a brief overview of this fellowship. It's envisioned as a way to break down some of the siloed reporting that we often see about China's Belt and Road Initiative project, about development projects in the Global South. And so it's a co-reporting fellowship where we have 4 Cenophone fellows and 4 Global South fellows who are paired to co-investigate, co-research, and co-write articles on this Belt and Road Initiative. So to get started, maybe I'd like all of you to share a little bit about what that co-writing process has been like for you. So Brian, I know you and Nuvek are partners, so maybe you two can go first.
Sure, I guess I could start. Yeah, I mean, we just come up with the pitches, and then after that, we kind of look at the different sides. And sometimes it is that, for example, because Norfolk is at more close to where the stories are often happening, he'll write about the companies and so forth, and I look and see what then can be supplemented with the Chinese language materials. And it can vary wildly between stories because I think what materials are available and just the differences in context. But it's usually like that. Other times, for example, we might just kind of work separately, then kind of bring the two halves together later on in the process. So I think that also depends, but it also depends on the story.
Cool. And Nurbeck, are you still with us? Might be having some technical challenges. Okay.
Maybe Hasha can go. I will just set up myself
Sure.
at a new place.
Of course. So Hasia, can you share about the co-writing process?
yeah, so I think it's actually similar with what Brian said, like about it. Like I think the co-writing process was interesting for me. I mean, it was very insightful in a way that we actually, when we talk about like an issue that involves like different countries, we tend to only like cover the story about that country, like the country they're investing. But we don't really know, we don't really understand about the context in, for example, in China, and how actually it get published there, like for the same issue, like how it actually presented there, how it actually published in their news outlet. And I think it's very insightful, and also like I think it's really interesting and fun the way that we brainstorm the ideas, and also how we actually put different contexts from each countries in geopolitically. So it has been fun so far, and I have a great partner, and I really like her, and I think she's amazing, and she gave me a lot of feedback. So I would say that no complaint, it was great and it was fun.
I agree with what Brian and Asha mentioned and described the co-writing process. I- it's uh, it's a great chance to learn, to embed the Chinese perspective into our work, to explain why investments and cooperation is taking place at such a scale, using Chinese resources, and it is a big challenge for like non-Sinophone people to access them, even to find them. But also, I think there's also you have different approaches, not just Sinophone, but I think personally you learn so much more from your peers, how they structure their research, how they sort of convey messages, and it has been a great experience that I had as well. Peer learning, not just sort of co-writing, but also peer learning, and also understanding Chinese sources better, Chinese perspective better.
So Haskia, you and Nurbek have both referred to some of the barriers in accessing Sinophone sources, and I assume language is one of those. But can you guys discuss what other barriers are in place? Like maybe Brian, if you want to field this one, why is it so difficult for people outside the region to find solid material?
Oh, should I start? Oh, yeah. Okay, person, I guess.
Okay, so probably, of course, the first thing is, of course, the language barrier. Like, even though obviously you can use Google Translate and you can actually look into it, but also the second, I think it's about like which sources that are actually a reliable one, or what was I don't even know like the name of like a different media outlet in China. So it was pretty challenging for us to actually like know how to actually look for information in different language and in different news outlets. Like we don't even understand like which one is actually reliable one. So I think it's a bit. I think that's the challenge for me. Like, what is the domains? Who can I trust? Like, which news outlet that I can trust to actually when we talk about like certain issues, and also like the political situation there, like for which like you don't really understand the landscape. So it's really important to have like a partner that actually understand about like how is it there.
Just to add to that, so there is a sort of language barrier and also like, sort of absence of knowledge about media landscape, and I think there's also this lack of accumulated knowledge about China overall, like accumulated knowledge and expertise about how the Chinese authorities operate, how they communicate, what do they imply by when they say certain things. So it's also like where to look, how to look, but also like what to make out of it, of what's available. I think that's also very important because they have a accumulated knowledge and expertise of how the state apparatus works, how it interacts with media outlets. So in that regard, having a partner like Brian has been very helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the Chinese language sources is that they're often they slant towards state sources and also corporate releases because that's what's out there. And that's actually not always the most interesting stuff, but it does tell you the kind of perspective that they want to put out there. And then a lot of academic institutions, for example, there might be like 3 pages of just this boilerplate text that is this narrative that they want out there, and then you get to the meat that is actually interesting and gives you something useful for what you're doing. And so, yeah, I think it's something that's a bit harder maybe to contextualize on the outside. And because we do have kind of the, we are actually also operating at distance. So we can't go there and just do the interviews on the ground with people and do that kind of style of reporting. So that ends up being secondary sources. But I also think it's also interesting because of the fact that China, though there's actually readily information in state sources and they're actually reliable as well, some perspectives can't be there. So it actually ends up in, for example, English language writing. And so then it ends up being that it ends up inherently being a multilingual process sometimes of writing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I absolutely agree with everything you said about the barriers. And that's that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed watching you guys all work together, because it's been fascinating seeing you overcome some of these roadblocks and, uh, just the wide expanse of information that you're able to access as in your pairings. Um, so to move on a little bit, I was wondering if you guys could talk about China's role within your regions in terms of investment in the environmental situation right now. So focusing on Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Maybe Nurbek, if you can go first.
Yeah, sure. To set the context, I think it's important to mention that China is biggest lender, trade partner, and also investor. If not the biggest, then maybe top 2, top 3. So its importance cannot be overstated, and especially in the economic sphere. So, and from this sort of contextual information, we can see that the investments are vast. They cover almost every field, including environmental, like renewable energy, but also steel manufacturing, oil and gas extraction, cars, pharmaceuticals, you name it. And this presence is only, investments are only growing. So in a way, China is both a polluter, but also a problem solver. Whenever I think it aligns with their own political agenda and their own economic interests, such as in the case of renewable energy. So excess capacity in terms of solar panels, they need to sort of find new markets for their companies, and that has been sort of expanding. Similar trend we noted in waste incineration. So instead of having open pit landfills, there is also excess capacity. There is not enough waste to incinerate in China anymore, so there is more expansion to other regions of the world, and Central Asia happens to be one of them, where it's rapidly growing number of Chinese waste incineration plants. But also at the same time, whenever they want to export environmental degrading industries as well, such as cement production or steel manufacturing, steel work, that also falls into, Central Asia also has to sort of bear it as an investment. So it's complex, I think, and it's mostly driven by interests of both countries, actually. The host nations, the host regions, but also of Chinese state.
Very cool. Brian, do you have anything you want to add about the context here, since you're also working on Central Asia?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because then on the China side, you see kind of repeating patterns, particularly among the companies. For example, there is overcapacity issue. That's why a lot of renewables are moving to Central Asia, but also Southeast Asia. But then the rhetoric kind of often comes up the same over and over again from the companies themselves or from the state. For example, they always talk about the New Silk Road and how there's thousands of years of history and that now we're revitalizing it. And then usually if it's like, XYZ country in Central Asia, sometimes they actually don't get into the specifics of each country actually in terms of the history. They just talk more about like the New Silk Road, or that there is, for example, a stable political situation. So we might come in here and work together for win-win interest and that sort of thing. And I think also just the background of some of the companies as well. It does depend as well, because sometimes you get a company that doesn't seem to have a lot of interesting story behind it, but then some have interesting founders that have backgrounds that were sometimes working with the Chinese government or in the military, when it went to, like, for example, like became a tax official or something like that. So that can be interesting. It really depends. But then I think allows you to understand more about how China looks at Central Asia, maybe, and understand some of the challenges there.
Great. And Hasia, do you want to talk about the context within Indonesia?
Yeah, so thanks, Sydney. And I think it's actually pretty similar with what Rebecca has said. Like it's actually like all the same areas, the same sectors. Like from what I know over the last few years, I believe that China is becoming the top three investors in Indonesia, alongside with Singapore and Hong Kong. And I think the main, also like just like Central Asia, like the main sector of the investment in Indonesia, especially, of course, the green transitions, let's say, about the nickel mining and nickel industrial manufacturing. And also, like, the steel manufacturing is also, like, one of the main investment as well in Indonesia. And also, like, now we all know that Vietnam has been the manufacturing hub for China for solar farms. And also, like, these days, because of the US that China started to build like some other like factories in Indonesia as well, and in Malaysia and in Laos and Cambodia as well, to build a new manufacturing hub. And for Indonesia case, I think China also invested a lot in infrastructure, like transportations, like a lot of like our infrastructures in terms of transportation also heavily rely on China investment, and also telecommunications and digital and e-commerce like Join or TikTok. We have the ByteDance in Indonesia. It's a very big company. So I think almost like every sector is just like similar with what Central Asia, also how China also like approach Central Asia. And at the same time, we also have the Mekong Delta, Mekong River, where it's a very important and a vital geopolitics elements between Southeast Asia and China, which is China in the upstream and several Southeast Asia countries downstreams. And I think that caused a lot of like incremental problem as well as like some geopolitical challenge between those countries. But at the same time, like also Norbik said, that China also brought some solution towards the climate justice. For example, like the waste to energy plan, like there have been a couple of like investment in waste to energy plant in Indonesia. For now, we have so many problems with waste in Southeast Asia. We import a lot of waste in Southeast Asia. So I think probably China also like could be the solution in bringing their technology, like the waste to energy plant to Southeast Asia. I think that's for me.
Great. And so I noticed both Norbek and Brian, in your answers, you touched on this overcapacity problem, where China has invested so much money in building up some of the supply chains and industry capacity, and now there isn't enough demand domestically. So what industries are you seeing this in for the most part? Whoever wants to field this one.
I can list, and then if I miss anything, maybe Brian can add. So renewable energy, solar panels especially, but also components for wind turbines. There are now more projects at localizing production of components for renewable energy, such as wind turbines. I think that's a priority because it's more difficult to transport them. It's more costly, and also in some cases you even need a special infrastructure, some roads maybe too narrow, or when you turn, the turn is sort of too tight, the angle is also problematic. So there's more of that. Definitely waste incineration. For example, in Uzbekistan, they're going to build 7 waste incineration plants. Kyrgyzstan 3, and then I think in Kazakhstan they're planning to do 4. So it's like more than a dozen already in the last 2 years, basically. EV production, I think, is another big overcapacity, especially given how much it has been subsidized, and then cement. I think that's also another overcapacity. also driven not just by overcapacity, but also tighter environmental regulation. So companies that can no longer compete domestically or feel more pressure to adopt more environmental friendly technologies have to look beyond their borders. I think this comes to mind. Maybe Brian can add anything. Something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd ask is it reflects a broader shift in China, where in some of the academic texts on this, they will talk about that, now shifting towards free market mechanisms. There's a lot of state involvement in pushing for renewables, but also EVs. And that was very much a characteristic of that, but then now leads to overcapacity and then expanding now to other parts of the world that's framed in terms of in line with the free market, but also becoming a responsible stakeholder in the kind of international world order. And then actually, despite that, this is framed in that way, also still dovetailing with state priorities to actually build ties through Belt and Road and the New Silk Road and so forth. So ironically, the state is still also there in that sense.
Yeah, super interesting. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and ask you guys to talk about some of the stories that you've worked on together. Hasya, do you want to maybe share what interesting things you found in your research?
Okay, so I think there are like a couple of things that I found interesting in the research during the fellowships, but I will say that one of the specific story, let's say, that I actually found the most interesting is about the durian, the fruit. I think I learned a lot about the agricultural landscape and about like Sydney. I quoted Sydney in this, like how appetite in one country could actually trigger something at the other part of the world. Like how the appetite, for example, in China, how the people obsessions to durian actually could trigger like environmental impact in other part of the world, which is Southeast Asia, where we actually export a lot of like durian to China. I think that's really interesting about like how to think not only about like the climate or environmental issue as something as big as like mining industry or green transition or energy or solar panel, but it's also like in our plate, like on our plate, like we can actually talk about it in a very simple or smallest way that we actually do every day, like the choices that we make every day about like the food that we eat, about like what clothes that we wear. So I think it's a very interesting approach for me. In the middle of like this big issue or big approach regarding about like the investment in China, in Indonesia or Southeast Asia in terms of like the solar panel or nickel or waste colonialism and everything else and waste to energy plan. To have this one story that is talking about more about like something not smaller but something more have a closer impact to us as a person because we eat that. It's really interesting.
And from the, can you talk a little bit more about what the climate justice implications of the durian story were? How did that fit into, this justice angle that we're getting into?
Sure. Yeah. So Indonesia is about to have this investment from China. So we have this open agreement about like exporting like a durian, the whole fruit, to China. I think probably around next year. But at the same time, with this new agreement about the food, it means that we will open like a lot of like a new plantation for durians to actually produce a large number of durian to actually fulfill the export that we wanted, the economic revenue that we wanted to have. And we need to think about like what kind of this durian plantation, could it mean something to the environment? what is the implication of the environment when you open like a large plantation, a large number of scale of like durian to the environment? What will be gone? What will we sacrifice in return to fulfill this export number? And also like we like to think about like, is there any like biodiversity challenge there when you open like hectares and hectares of like durian plantation? So I think we tend to think that way about like how it fit in into the climate justice issue. Yeah, I hope that answer your question.
It does, yeah. The monoculture, massive monoculture industry is can be quite damaging. So thanks for clarifying that. Brian and Nurek, do you want to share about some of the stories you've written?
Yeah, I guess I'd jump in, I guess. Just to list off, for example, about waste processing in Kyrgyzstan or renewable energy in Kazakhstan or cement plants in Tajikistan. So a lot more about renewable industries and the impact there, but we also wrote about, for example, anti-Chinese sentiment in Uzbekistan, and then how China's aided efforts to fight desertification in the Aral Sea. So I think the attempt was often to highlight both the positives and the negatives. For example, helping fight desertification is a very good thing. And renewables can also be helpful, but then there's also a double-edged sword sometimes if in terms of there are local environmental impacts, though there's actually renewables. And so I think we often try to do that. Yeah, I don't know what you want to add, Nurbeck.
I think that some of we've written stories about renewable energy, cement, waste incineration, copper mining, and then we plan to do more stories. So I think that one of the things that popped up, I think, is a communication or problem with communication and lack of transparency in some cases. And that's something that has been an issue in almost all of the countries, especially 10 years ago or even 6 years ago. And it has been evidenced by some protests that flared up in the region. And I think now they're doing a better job, Chinese companies and state overall. For some companies, they don't have a website. But I think the larger issue is that there is no transparency or communication about what will the project entail, what sort of impact it will have, including negative, and how it will be mitigated. So they say, some companies ignore this aspect altogether. Others say, trust us, it's not going to bring any negative impact. And then when there's when journalists or maybe activists try to engage with them, there's a lot of hesitancy for open dialogue, for open engagement. And I think that also there's a barrier, cultural and also linguistic, with local population. So there's people are more apprehensive about them because they can't talk directly to workers. They can't read about companies. They can find information about it in Chinese media, and overall the Chinese companies are not sort of proactive in sort of communicating with community. Maybe they do more so with authorities, especially state authorities, national level. But I guess less so with local ones. So there's sort of this conflict potential or between host communities and also investors.
So I want to ask a follow-up question about the situation in Central Asia, but I also want to remind the folks watching that if you leave a comment in the chat, we'll have a Q&A session at toward the end of this talk. So please, if you want to follow up on anything, leave a comment. And so back to the situation in Central Asia, I really liked what you said in the beginning about how China is simultaneously, a huge part of the problem and also a huge part of the solution. And I think you guys have done a great job of illustrating this phenomenon in your region, where some of the stories have been, are sharing some devastating impacts and ways that local communities have been severely affected by either unregulated or Chinese corporations that have run amok in some areas. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of spaces where Chinese investment, Chinese companies are part of the solution. And I believe your recent article is officially live, the RLC one. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this as a positive story that you found.
I can do a short summary about this, our latest piece. It was about how China was cooperating with Uzbekistan to save, I don't know if to save is a proper word, but to save whatever is left of the RLC. It was once a fourth largest lake in the world, and now more than 90% of it's gone. And it's now a desert, basically, and it's now instead of RLC, it's Aral sand. But now we have seen this growing cooperation between the two countries on, basically, it's introducing a drip irrigation system to save water that could be further directed towards the lake. And then second is introducing salt resistant, or how do you call salient resistant, but special types of plants that could be grown in deserts. And China has a lot of experience in afforestation, restoring deserts, and it looks a bit promising, especially given that the drip irrigation system will be upscaled on a national level, and there are promises that it could help save a lot of water. It looks positive, promising, but I think a lot of it will also depend on the host nations, Uzbek authorities, on how they will use the saved water. Will they cultivate more land directly there, or will they actually try to salvage what's left of the lake and direct the water there? But I think it's certainly a huge act of goodwill from the Chinese side, and a major diplomatic win for them. And at the end, we also said about how it's already a winner from this cooperation, because again, it helps to reinforce this positive image without them risking any reputational damage. For example, if it doesn't work out, the lake is almost gone, and then even if it doesn't work out, it will be the host nations that will be blamed, I guess.
Brian, do you have anything to add about this?
Not particularly, but yeah, I mean, for example, roles China plays in investigating the RLC, because it is, particularly interesting, but also bringing its own experiences, which is verification, like for example, the Taran River Basin, but also like salt-resistant plants and things like that. And so it is quite interesting, because I mean, it is an issue that is found in more parts of the world than just one, of course, but it's a very prominent, I think, symbol. And so then that is quite interesting looking into that. Yeah.
And you briefly mentioned, Nurbek, China's image in the region, and how this is a win because it's trying to bolster its reputation. So how is China perceived within Central Asia? And Indonesia as well, Hasil. I'll jump to you in a second, but are people largely accepting? Is there hostility? What's the climate right now?
For a long time, I think it has been less favorable. The issue with it is difficult to measure. There has been only one research institution that followed it over the years, and the last sort of survey was held in 2023, and that's when it was first recorded a slight positive turn in two countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and also a more negative turn in Uzbekistan. So I think that it's changing. It's slowly changing, like it's, and also I think it's also varies greatly with different groups. So, for example, I think it's more negative among religious community because of the Chinese policies in Xinjiang and the persecution of sort of ethnic minorities, Muslim minorities. So, if you ask them, it will be probably more negative, and also some of the local businessmen whose businesses are being affected because they cannot outcompete is also probably going to be negative. But I think overall, a regular customer, a regular person is either neutral or maybe even positive. In some places, this negative attitude is more aggressive, meaning people are more actively engaged in, or at least war, in protest. In other parts, it remains in sort of like latent form. People are maybe slightly negative, but they're not ready to go out and protest. Not only because they don't dislike it a lot, or maybe I think it also has to do with sort of overall political environment where protesting is prohibited in general. So I think we also have to take that into account.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Hasya, do you want to talk about the context in Indonesia?
Sure. So I think it's similar with what the situation in Central Asia, like what Herbert just explained. It's for me, I think it's hard to generally say like, is it like getting better? Is it positive or is it negative? Like different contexts, even different regions might be have a different perspective about it. For example, I could say that, for example, in some hotspots for the nickel industrial park, for example, in Sulawesi or in North Maluku, because there are a lot of because it's almost like all the companies are owned by China, like it's China Indonesian companies, and China brought like a lot of Chinese worker there, which has different, for example, a dormitory, different environment, even different salaries. It causes a lot of conflicts horizontally between the people, and it causes certain idea for locals about they have this kind of negative sentiments towards the Chinese worker because of the situation they created by the company in this case. And but also in generally we have a very long history with the riots, political riots in Indonesia in '98, and how the '98 riots in Indonesia was like the tip point of the hatred toward Chinese Indonesian people, which now is, I would say that which now is getting better. People started to be more aware and be more educated about the issue. But at the same time, because I heard that Nurbeck say about the competitions between the businessmen, what I know is a lot of for example, in textile industry in Indonesia, we used to be in Jakarta, in Tanah Abang, we used to be the largest textile market in Southeast Asia, where a lot of foreigners came to bought a lot of textile for wholesale. But because of we were floating by Chinese cheap products, which brought a lot of so many companies now went bankrupt, and the textile industry is really at stake. We sacrifice it because we know only import a lot of cheap stuff. We could not even when I did the interview with the people with the businessmen, they said we could not compete anymore with Chinese goods because they're obviously they're cheaper and they are in a better quality, for example. So this kind of sentiment, this kind of situation created another sentiment toward Chinese, toward whatever it is about Chinese. So it's complicated, I would say.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, Hasya, because this is something that across regions we've seen kind of again and again, that challenge of industries trying to compete and trying to refusing to get pushed out in certain areas. So I hope people check out some of the stories we've written on that topic. So Brian, do you have anything else to add about the reputation of China in Central Asia or Taiwan, where you're from, if you want to add that as well, in terms of the green investment?
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is of course very different, and there's a geopolitical tension with China. But then sometimes there is talk when there is the more pro-China party in power, for example, accepting BRI projects or getting economic closer to China. And I think it's interesting because particularly, of course, know much more from the China studies side of things. And there's always this debate about, debt trap diplomacy. And is it actually China trying to coerce the world or pressure weaker countries into accepting all these things? But then there's also a lot of kind of mystifications about it. And it can be very just kind of trying to make China look bad, particularly because other countries want China to look bad. And so is that. And so I think it does require this kind of nuance there. But I think also then it was also interesting for me thinking about just the history that China draw on for its rhetoric a lot of times in terms of the New Silk Road, and always framing this as a very positive thing in the past. But then it's actually often, I think, in Central Asia, I found historically there's a much more ambiguous relationship towards China that's just not recent, not even the modern People's Republic of China, but the ancient dynastic China. And so I think there's also, it's interesting to look at that kind of resonance as well and how it plays into maybe long-term historical attitudes towards groups, migrant groups, including Chinese and so forth.
Really interesting. Thank you, Brian. So we've talked quite a bit about how China is simultaneously part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And one of our goals when we were conceptualizing this fellowship and throughout for the last 2 years that we've been running it is so adding some more nuance to the discussions, because I think so often when you see reporting involving China or the BRI, it's either entirely negative or entirely positive. We're trying to find some to stay in that gray area, stay in reality. And so I'm wondering for you guys, how have you managed to balance your reporting as you're investigating some of these topics? What have been your strategies to kind of find that sweet spot? Maybe Hassia, you want to go first?
Sure. Strategy balancing that. I think for us, for I and my partner, we tend to have the helicopter view first. I think we always try to gather as many ideas as we can, and we always trying to not only looking only from one side of the story. We also try to explore more about what can we talk about different issues and how we approach the issues differently. Because of course, when we are talking about the damage or environmental impacts, there are plenty of stories about it, covered widely by so many media outlets. So we try to look into from the other perspective or from another perspective, and we try to bring probably the solution journalism, or we try to have it in a more for example, we interview with an expert about what kind of infrastructure or in China that probably could work in Southeast Asia to actually tackle, for example, the flooding issues or the pollutions and everything else. And I think that's how we work to balance it. We try to look from the helicopter view about everything else, and we don't come in with a judgment. So we just try to explore as many issues as possible.
I mean, for me, I ask myself a question what problem does it help to solve? Whether that's unemployment, whether that's lack of energy or electricity costs in winter, maybe it's dependency on foreign imports of cement, for example. That's also an issue, right? So what problem locally does it solve? I think that's also important for balancing, because you also show, okay, yes, there's this problem that's being exacerbated by another problem is being solved. And also, I forgot my second point, sorry, maybe Brian can go ahead.
Yeah, I think oftentimes I'm looking at like the state sources or the corporate releases, and then it's overly positive. It's like, oh, everything is great, and so forth. They love to use the term win-win cooperation. But I also think that it's worth remembering that it is actually true that there are two parties negotiating, and both sides would have to think there's some positive to be gained out of it to actually come to such an agreement. And so though people always laugh at this term win-win agreement or cooperation, it's one of these like boilerplate phrases you see in Chinese everywhere. There's also some truth, at least from the state perspective, from the state of a policymaker in Central Asia or elsewhere. There's a reason why they view this as advantageous. And so there's that, but then there's also the flip side in terms of local communities. And even then, though, I think oftentimes, I'm mostly a social movement journalist. I'm writing on the communities that are angry about some development project in Taiwan, almost always in Taiwan. But then you do see splits in communities too, where people view it as creating jobs and the community is dependent on this. And so I think everything is always a kind of double-edged sword, and that's a kind of perspective I try to go into. There's always two sides to everything. There's always someone that will support it and someone who will be against it.
Yeah, I remember at my second point. So one question is like, so what problem does it solve? And then another one is like, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? For example, in case of renewable energy, the alternative would be European companies that are first of all not interested in investment because they don't view this region as particularly sort of safe for investments, but also it would be a lot more expensive because a lot more challenging to transport things, costly. The towers for like wind power plants, the sort of turbines are a lot more costly, and then like if there wasn't sort of this Chinese company mining or I don't know any sort of engaging, like what would be the alternative? Like nothing sometimes, like it's oftentimes nothing. And so there's that. It's not a region where like we have a swarming group of investors like dying to open new plants, or so there's oftentimes not much of an alternative.
Thanks for sharing, Nurbeck. I'm happy you framed it that way, because I think it's interesting to think about, you're right, for many regions, it's not like there's a lot of options. It's not like, people sometimes act as if Western power, China's displacing Western powers, but for a lot of regions, the reality is, there weren't outside investors to begin with. So I'm really happy you brought that up. So we have time for about one more question, and then we can, from me, and then we can switch to some audience Q&A. We have a couple people who've left some comments. So I'm going to ask all of you, what is the most surprising finding that emerged from this fellowship, from the co-reporting process? Brian, maybe you can go first.
Sure. I think for me, oftentimes I was looking at very different sources than I was in the past, because again, I'm a social movement journalist, and so it's more like social media posts or things like that if I'm looking at stories in etc. And so then I think particularly looking at all these corporate releases and government statements, one really does have a sense of how repetitive it is sometimes. Like it's like the same text over and over again. And I think that's kind of thing that somewhat surprised me. I feel like in terms of kind of elaborating on how a BRI or whatever is understood or framed in terms of ideology or history, like I kind of knew that would be the case, but it still kind of surprised me. Yeah.
Very cool. And Hafia?
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing I learned probably about how, for example, like one of the hot issue right now, the green transition and its impact in local communities, in local mining, just like to learn like how it actually how it actually represented in Senegal media outlets, like how they actually talk about the issue, and just surprising about like how probably like not so many coverage about like how it's damaged the local community. But after all, I think it's not like the most surprising things that actually interesting for me. It's about the learning process and the peer working with all of the fellows. It has been very insightful. So it's more about the learning process through all the stories that we write.
I, so for me, it has been maybe not most surprising, but yes, maybe yeah. At how many different things the BIR tag is slapped on. So for example, it can be any project, and all of it is sort of framed as part of BRI. I don't know. I guess us as sort of like regions on the receiving end may think of BRI as sort of infrastructure or like roads or railroad project, but then you have this like renewable energy and also steel plant, and then anything else is labeled as BRI, you know. So I guess there's no discernible border or like sort of limitation to what BRI is and like what it covers. It has become this sort of, I don't know, constantly changing terms that can be sort of applied onto any Chinese investments, regardless if it's state or private, or regardless of the industry, regardless of the impact. So I guess that's what sort of has been surprising to me for me.
Yeah, one of the stories that your team published comes to mind, where, what was it? It was China had labeled a project that was funded by EU investees and had labeled it a BRI project. So the politics there can just be fascinating. But I think that's a great point. So we can go ahead and jump to the audience questions now. So if you're watching, feel free to leave a comment for our panelists. So the first one is, can you unpack how perceptions of China might differ between elites and average citizens? Who benefits and how from BRI projects? Who wants to take this one?
I could jump in quickly on the China side, though I'm probably not the person to answer this question. But it's interesting because the state media and the corporate sources often really try to highlight both elites and average citizens. So you just have the quote from the policymaker that, oh, this is great, and et cetera, it's great. And you have the quote from the local citizen, which I find sometimes very hard to believe. For example, it seems very ventriloquizing a perspective, saying that I don't believe, for example, I tend to be skeptical when I see a local citizen talking about how proud they are to bring Chinese cars into Central Asia. That seems a bit unbelievable. I mean, there may be positive views, for example, about building up infrastructure and so forth, but it tends to be framed in a way that just, I find it a bit unbelievable. Yeah, but someone else I think could answer that.
I think it's incredibly difficult to answer this question, like, definitively. But overall, I think that every citizens and elites have very different interests. I think that elites operate between election cycles. They have much shorter sort of time period in which they're supposed to solve issues. And I think for elites, having an investor and a partner such as China can help it solve so many different problems, so many sort of diverse problems, and I think it makes them more inclined, or maybe a lot more favorable to Chinese investments and every citizen, because every local community has to live there for a longer period of time. It doesn't have to worry about election cycle. It doesn't have to worry about potential protest. So I think in that sense, that's just assumption. I don't know. I haven't come across any sort of actual data on it, and in terms of who benefits from BIM projects. I think elites benefit from it, but also locals benefit from it because, especially like roads, you have new paved roads. It's a big boost for local economy, for every citizens, but also for the government to sort of display as a achievement and prepare for the next election cycle, or to maybe strengthen their positions.
I share this. Yeah, I share the same answer with Norbert. Like it's hard to answer the questions because yeah, like what Vic said, elites has different views and that different perspective. And I would say that maybe for elites in Indonesia, they saw China as a potential partner or as a potential partner for like different projects. But for average people, it could be a diverse answer how they actually what kind of perspective they share, and so it's hard, it's difficult to answer. But about like the who benefited from BRI, like what Ruben said, the elites benefited, probably some locals benefited as well, but it depends on which side of like which part of like the community that you represent, or which part of the community that you ask, because there always be like people that get sacrificed for the development of the things that they want to do, and just it depends.
So my next question is for Brian. I'm curious about your reflections on the Central Asia field trip. What stood out to you? Anything surprising or memorable, maybe tied to the stories you worked on with Norbert? So for the audience, some context, our Cinephone fellows all did a field trip to various regions to help them learn more about the region. In most cases, they met up with their partner and got to hang out with the other fellows. So over to you, Brian.
Yeah, it was interesting traveling around. And so I went to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. I think it's also very different than when you're actually there and you can put not a face, but you see the actual thing. Like it's one thing to write about EVs, Chinese EVs, and then you actually see the BYD cars. And then it's another thing to write on the RLC, and then like you meet up with your friend in, I don't know, like Kazakhstan, and mention the RLC, and they start free associating, and they talk about there's like a museum there with Soviet art, and there's like a prison in the middle of the sea, and now it's connected by land, and there's this art project in there and things like that. And so it's always then interesting there. I think it was also surprising though, and more interesting, and it's harder to do from a distance when you're looking at things online. Mostly is talking to the Chinese people that are there, or who is there from China. And so I ran to a number of Uyghurs, for example, and that's quite interesting talking to them. And they were very surprised when they learned I'm from Taiwan and asked a lot of questions and things like that. And I thought that was very interesting. That really stood out. Some conversation was slightly strange, I thought, but is with the Uyghurs I ran into and things like that. But it was very interesting. I feel like I learned a lot about the overall dynamics, I think, of the region in that sense.
Very cool. Thank you, Brian. So we have time for one more question. And this is from a viewer. Is there something you thought you knew about the region you were paired with that you found out you were wrong about? So, does anyone want to take this? So I guess for Norbert and Hess.
Okay,
sure.
Sorry. Yeah, because I didn't know a lot about Central Asia before this, so that's actually why I picked Central Asia, because I felt like compared to similar other regions, for example, Africa or Southeast Asia, I felt like knew a lot more. So that was why I chose that. So I'm not sure if there are things I was wrong about, because I did not know a lot to start with. Yeah.
So Hassia and Norbert, I think your region could be considered China in this case, or your own, if there's something that you found you were wrong about.
I think that maybe not wrong about, but you learn more about is that China is now present almost in almost every sector. So it's involved in so many different things. And I think that's if you're a journalist, especially if you're regular citizens, you never know about such things. Because if China is not your big topic, you don't interact with it daily. You don't work in the sphere. You don't understand the scale of its presence. Anything from pharmaceuticals to gold mining to wind turbines to gas, oil, solar panels. Almost in every field, fertilizers, anything, you name it, there's going to be some considerable degree of Chinese presence. And I think that's something that doesn't come across to you if you're not sort of deep into this topic.
Similar with Norbeck as well. Like what I said, I didn't come in with any judgment or perspective. This is a learning process for me. I don't have like something like I don't have any idea that I have in mind that is wrong because I took it as a learning process and I unlearned whatever I knew before I jumped into the project. So it's a learning process without any you just came empty without any perspective or judgment before you come in for the fellowship. So I would say that it's a learning process for me.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing and for making the time to be here with us today. And thank you for everyone who tuned in and is also watching after the fact, since this is on YouTube. Yeah, please keep an eye out for more stories from our climate justice fellows and follow along with the impressive work they're doing. So thank you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.